Okay, we are online now. Hi, everybody. Hello, Dr. Lin, you are muted.
Yeah. Hello, everybody. So, welcome back to our TLTS Research Seminar Series. And today I'm especially happy to have my old friend from Singapore, Dr. Muklis Abu Abba Bakar, because I usually address Dr. Bakar as Muklis. And I think I met Dr. Bakar back in 2003 when I was invited by Professor Alan Nook to visit NIE in Singapore. So we are very, very, very privileged today because Dr. Bakar is an expert about the bilingual education policy in Singapore, especially with reference to the impact on indigenous language communities, minority language communities. So Dr. Bakar is Associate Professor at the Malay Language and Culture Division of NIE, National Institute of Education, Nanyang Technological University in Singapore. He's a professor in the teaching track. He teaches Malay grammar, language and literacy, critical approaches to language and bilingualism, and bilingual education. And his research focuses on bilingualism, biliteracy in early childhood, sociocultural approaches to literacy, learning at the home, school, and faith settings, and issues in Malay language communities. So his recent book, The Bloomsbury Handbook of Cultural Identity from Early Childhood to Early Adulthood, is co-edited with his colleagues. And just recently, just last month, he received the National Institute of Education's Excellence in Teaching Commendation Award. And also in 2011 and 2018. So you can be sure that Mokles, Dr. Bakar is an excellent teacher and an excellent researcher. And without further delay, let's turn the speaking floor to Mokles. Dr. Bakar, over to you.
Right. Thank you so much. Good evening for those of you in Canada, and good morning for those across the Pacific in Hong Kong and Singapore. I do not know whether anyone in Singapore is watching this. So thank you, Professor Angel Lin, for the introduction. I would also like to thank the Faculty of Education, Simon Fraser University, for hosting me as a visiting scholar this fall. It has been a fruitful time so far here in Canada, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to work on a couple of publication projects under the guidance of Professor Angel Lin. I'm also auditing two of her graduate courses, which is quite an eye-opener for me, and which I'm really thankful. Right. Xinhua, is the slide being shared now?
No, not
should
yet.
I share it now?
Nope, not yet.
So you will be sharing it for me, right?
Oh no. You will start the sharing just as.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, as just now.
Okay. Yeah. Right. Okay. So let me just start by saying a little about the context in which I've been in which I've been working. I've been with the Malay Division of the Asian Languages and Cultures of the National Institute of Education since 2002. As you might probably know, NIE is a teacher training institute of the Nanyang Technological University. My students are student teachers sent by the Ministry of Education. Hang on, let me just move the slide to the next one. Okay. As I was saying, my students are student teachers sent by the Ministry of Education to NIE to be trained as a Malay language teacher at the primary or secondary school, as well as to read for their Bachelor of Arts in Malay language. And just like me, they went through an English medium education throughout their 12 or 13 years in primary, secondary, and junior college. But they also take Malay language as a subject, either at the second language level or at a higher level. In school, the Malay language should be considered their heritage language, or what we call, or what in Singapore would call the mother tongue, a term which has a peculiar meaning in Singapore, and which I will discuss in a little more detail later. Despite their greater facility with English, they are, I think, the more bilingual among their cohort, as many of them would have taken Malay at a higher level and has that interest in the language to the extent that they want to be Malay language teachers. And as Malay language student teachers at NIE, the bulk of the courses they take are delivered through the medium of Malay, while the other standard courses, which all student teachers, irrespective of their specialized subjects, are taught in English. So like my colleagues in the Malay division, I teach all my courses through the medium of Malay, and my student teachers read, write, and engage in class discussion in Malay. So only at NIE that they are immersed in the Malay language, though not completely. I have talked about a bit about my student teachers because they are the small minority of students among their school cohort who, after completing 12 or 13 years of schooling, still speak, read, and write in Malay by virtue of the fact that they've signed up here to read Malay language at NIE for their bachelor program and also their teacher training. Now, this despite their greater facility with English. The same cannot be said of others back in their school who would have found little need to continue using the Malay language once they completed their school. The Malay language curriculum in school has prepared them well for exams, affirming their ethnic identity, but they may not be comfortable using the language in daily interaction with their friends, siblings, and even their parents, and even while they are still in school. Now, this is because of the dominance of English in their school and in the Singapore society in general. So without regular use of the language after leaving school, they would not lose their language, but in most probability, lose their facility with the language. This brings me to the center of the topic of my talk about the unique nature of Singaporean bilingualism, which develops from the language policy of the school system. So from the start of schooling, in fact, from preschool, all students in Singapore study the English language as well as take core courses such as mathematics, the sciences, the humanities, all of which are in English. And English is a medium of instruction for all examinable subjects except the mother tongue. Now, I've been using the term mother tongue without really noting its unique usage in the Singapore context. In Singapore, one's mother tongue is an ascribed language assigned on the basis of one's father's ethnicity. So it is not necessarily a language that one's mother even knows. Neither is it necessarily one's first language or habitually used language. In fact, increasing number of students from English-speaking homes first learn their mother tongue at school. perhaps it's not so much of an issue among the Malay community because basically they speak the Malay language, but perhaps among the Chinese community where they speak dialects. And so learning Mandarin Chinese in school as their mother tongue would be another language that they have to acquire apart from English. There is another set of unique terminology related to the instruction of language in schools. In the terminology of Singapore schools, English is to be learned at first language level, meaning learned at high proficiency, while the mother tongues are to be learned at second language level. In addition to high proficiency in English, students are expected to learn and use an internationally acceptable English. There is a kind of expectation that education will foster and maintain and idealize international variety, despite evidence that a localized variety of English with its own distinctive features is well established and commonly used for social purposes. A variety which we call in Singapore, Singapore English, or in short, Singlish. Now, since Singapore's independence in 1965, the integration of the education system with language and economic policies has been central to economic planning in Singapore. English learning is emphasized as it is seen as a neutral language. Perhaps we can debate on that. That can help build national cohesion via inter-ethnic communication. It also prepares the workforce to participate in economic opportunities via international trade, taking advantage of English as the world language. So within this English medium education, the mother tongue language serve to keep Singaporeans rooted to their respective cultures, values, and also identity. Right. Now, I hope by now you would have guessed why I used the. I don't know why my voice is suddenly cracking like this. Perhaps I'm a bit nervous here. Why I use the term single language bilingual education in the title of my presentation to describe Singapore's bilingual education system. It is single language bilingual education in two senses. Firstly, only one language, that is English, is the medium of instruction of all content subjects except the mother tongue subject. This means a student's exposure to the mother tongue in school is only during the mother tongue language lesson itself, which is about 6 hours a week. In addition, the linguistic landscape in the school is heavily tilted towards English. English is the main language. In some schools, the sole language of notices and messages and school walls, during school assembly, announcements made through the public address system, and the medium of instruction for non-examinable subjects, such as physical education and also music. So out of the almost 30 to 40 hours that students spend in school every week, their exposure to the mother tongue language is only 6 hours. Such a situation would, of course, give learners the impression that English is more important than the mother tongue language. Secondly, the language in education policy also dictates that there is a total separation of English and the mother tongue in the classroom, be it translanguaging as a pedagogy or as communication. As you would know, this violates the everyday language practices of bilingual and multilingual speakers. And despite this, of course, students and also teachers translanguage all the time when they communicate in class. But as a policy, at least, translanguaging is not encouraged. Right. The present language in education strategy, to my mind, appears to be based on the belief that individuals are expected to maintain cognitive separation of the linguistic systems, and that properly bilingual individuals are those in complete control of compartmentalized sets of monolingual proficiencies, such as English and Malay or Chinese. Associated with this belief is the idea that the bilingual capacity is finite and that no two languages can be kept at the same high proficiency. So between two languages, one has to give. It is therefore not surprising that the mother tongue is prescribed only at the second language level in view of the need to keep a high level of proficiency in English. But students are allowed to study the mother tongue at a higher level, but only if their test scores in the mother tongue are sufficiently high, and at the same time they score well in the other content subjects. So this normally takes place from upper primary through secondary level. On the other hand, for those who fail the core subjects or didn't do well in the core subjects, such as math, science, and English, at the primary school leaving examination, upon entry to the secondary level, they would, until a year ago, be channeled to what we call in Singapore a normal technical stream, where they would be required to learn English and mathematics at a basic level. And as far as language is concerned, only the oral skills of the mother tongue. So this normal technical stream, it makes certain assumptions about children's learning capabilities. Yeah, that they would be incapable of learning two languages effectively, and that this inability would translate to inability to cope with content subjects taught in English, and that this inability would also ultimately mean intellectual weakness. However, whatever the case may be, whether one takes the mother tongue at standard, higher level, or lower level, the time accorded to the mother tongue is around 6 hours a week. Yeah, still 6 hours a week within the 30 to 40 hours that students spend in school every week. So you can imagine the amount of time that students are exposed to the mother tongue language in school. Now, the belief about the separation of languages that I've shown in the previous slide is in contrast here to current ideas in the field of bilingual education, in that the general cognitive skills which underpin language use operate from a common central function, that all languages mutually enrich concept development, and that the ability to make sense of print transfers readily even when scripts are different, such as between English and Chinese. And this theoretical framework has been the basis for many of the successful bilingual approaches currently in use in the English-speaking world today, where the level of development of bilingual children's heritage language has a positive impact on the learning of a second language as well as their academic performance. Now, to a large extent, despite all the criticism that I've just mentioned just now, To a large extent, the bilingual education system in Singapore has worked and internationally regarded as successful. Considering just the English scores, for example, which would involve all students in the bilingual system, Singaporean students have performed well in English reading benchmarks against other English-speaking countries such as the UK, the USA, Australia, even Canada, and New Zealand, on international tests, such as the Program for International Student Assessment, PISA, and the Progress in International Reading and Literacy Study, or PEARLS. So Singapore's 15-year-olds were not only ranked #1 for mathematics, science, and reading, but also in the ability to solve problems in teams. Singapore students also top another global achievement test in mathematics and science. In the, I think, the trends in international mathematics and science study. So these surveys place Singapore students in a good light, in large measure due to the education system that requires students from all ethnic backgrounds to acquire English, through which the content subjects and the relevant skills needed are taught. But of course, the success cannot be attributed to the language policy alone, but through education reforms and initiatives that continue to shape Singapore's education system. So like revision to national assessments, ICT competencies for the 21st century, and so on. So they also contribute to the success of the Singapore education system. Now, while English and the associated achievements in the content subjects through the language has been the source of pride to Singapore, the same, I think, cannot be said of the state of the mother tongues, in particular among the young. Some unidentified consequences have been noted, but I'll just discuss two here. The first one being big shift in home languages, where English has continued to place the mother tongues as the dominant home language. And two, the class-based character in the changing landscape of home language use. As far as the first point is concerned, the strategy of differentiating the role and status of English and the mother tongues in education and in the public arena has engendered a visible language shift from the mother tongue languages towards English. And there are many data to support this. I'm showing here just two. Chart 1, as you can see on the slide, of the three mother tongue languages, Malay, compared to Mandarin and Tamil, has been frequently regarded as best maintained. As you can see on the chart, is the lower slope. Yeah. So they are, often regarded as best maintained, and also more resistant to language shift, for it serves communicative and religious functions in the Malay community. Being an indigenous community in Singapore, they tend to retain their language much more than perhaps the Chinese and Indian communities. So on the other hand, Mandarin, Chinese, and Tamil may instead only be studied as academic subjects by Chinese and Indian students. Moving to chart 2, this is more recent, which indicates a language shift from the mother tongue to English occurring at a rate faster for Malay children than children from Chinese or Indian families. So this is over the past decade, from 2000 2009 to 2019. And this data was released by the Ministry of Education and announced by the Prime Minister, Mr. Lee Hsien Loong, in 2019, where it shows that where 18% of Malay households spoke English as their main language 20 years ago, in 2009, now 67% do so. Yeah, a percentage that quickly closes the gap with the Chinese and Tamil. In yet another study, a sociolinguistic survey, which I don't show on the slide here, but I'm just mentioning here, a survey of primary 5 students in Singapore in 2006, 81% of Malay children use both English and Malay at home, compared to 61.1% of Chinese and 76% for Indian children. So these figures suggest a greater bilingual language environment in Malay homes, which has been touted by the by Singapore leaders as a really a positive a positive outcome of the bilingual education system. But given current language shift, the trends in current the trends in language shift, this bilingualism may just be transitional. In fact, it might move towards a potential language shift from Malay to more English in the near future. Because if we were to reflect in the past, during my generation, where I grew up with Malay at home and learned English only in school. But as I grow up, along with my friends, we went through an English medium education and we became more comfortable with English, so much so that now that we have our own families, we tend to use Malay, English to our children. And compared to the present generation, where they don't use the mother tongue language at home, and they only use and they learn the mother tongue only in school, we can't expect them to be able to transmit their mother tongue language to their children, because given my generation, who grew up with mother tongue language at home, we don't use the mother tongue language as much. What more with the present generation, where they don't use the mother tongue at home, only using them in school and only as a subject. So future generation, we can expect a more transition towards English in time to come. Right. Now, the educational directives to help the trend of language shifts has put the onus of change on mother tongue curricula, which need to realign themselves with the present day concerns of Singaporean youth. And this has led to major revamp in the mother tongue curricula over the years, as proposed separately in the report of the Chinese language curriculum and pedagogy review committee, the report of the Malay language curriculum and pedagogy review committee, and the report of the Tamil language curriculum and pedagogy review committee in 2005 and again in 2015. So every 10 years, there will be a review and there will be changes in response to the changing linguistic landscape in Singapore society. Customization of courses in the primary level and a greater focus on reading and oral communication have been some of the recommendations to help keep interest in mother tongues among students whose main language at home has shifted to English. The onus has also been placed on the Singaporean public They have been cajoled every now and then to speak at home using the mother tongue, to read mother tongue storybooks to their children, and sing and in the mother tongue language. So, and much investment actually has been put into these efforts through the setting up of the respective Chinese, Malay, Tamil language and promotion committees, the respective mother tongue language campaigns. We have the Speak Mandarin campaign. We have the Malay Language Month, and so on. And also since the last decade, the Ministry of Education has set up the Lee Kuan Yew Fund for Bilingualism, which is a body to fund programs to anyone who is interested to come up with activities, with projects to promote the use of the mother tongue languages in the Singapore society. So in this context, it makes sense to say that there has been much rethinking of language policies to address the problems accruing to English dominant bilingualism. However, the changes have not transformed the essence of bilingualism and the single language bilingual education in Singapore. Medium of instruction is rationalized through economic pragmatism, that it is needed to compete in the global market. While the mother tongue as second languages of education are justified as carriers of local cultures and histories needed to keep the country's Asian values alive in the midst of the so-called decadent values of the West creeping in through English. According to one of the foremost education specialists in Singapore, he says that the many sacred cows of bilingual education have escaped criticism because some of them are just too scared to review them. So not much has changed despite the fact that the language shift has continued at an even greater speed. Right, the unintended effects of the bilingual education system, which is a changing home language use through the lens of class. Now, I'm aware that the use of social class is not unproblematic, but as Bourdieu argues, it is a powerful concept because it actually involves the coupling of material and symbolic elements and dispositions, that define groups of people in a society. It is, of course, not reducible to one element only. So it is difficult to pin down. But education, socioeconomic status, and home background usually cluster together to form a particular social class, at least in Singapore. A point to note is that scholarly articulations of class-based issues in Singapore do appear in sociological studies, but are rather rare in educational and language policy-oriented research. One exception is that the work of Chow and Liu on Chinese. Now, they view the transformation of home language use with the mother tongue being pushed gradually out of the home to give way to English through the lens of class, specifically the correlations between home language use and socioeconomic variables such as housing conditions, occupation, educational qualification of parents, and type of kindergarten of children. And the results show somewhat remarkable parallels between language use and social stratification. One, the more expensive and exclusive the housing conditions are, the more likely that English is spoken rather than Chinese. And the reverse is true in less expensive housing units. Secondly, parents in dominantly English-speaking homes, they are more formally educated than their counterparts in dominantly Chinese-speaking homes. The third point, children from the economic elite and more affluent homes are more likely to attend private kindergartens where the teaching of so-called standard English is strong than children who come from lower income homes. And the latter are more likely to attend less expensive public kindergartens where the more colloquial type of English is taught, Singlish, for instance. So this already disadvantaging them before they start formal schooling, even if the language to be learned is supposed to be English. Fourthly, parents' choice is overwhelmingly to speak English to their children at home, given the, mother tongue language campaigns where, the government leaders have been telling them to use English at home. So, no, they try to speak English to their children at home, even those parents who believe that their English is not very good. This means that in low-income homes, where the desire to use English is also very strong, there is a high probability that the variety used is the colloquial one, which could, hamper the children's acquisition of the more standard variety that presumably carries more symbolic power and prestige. So as shown by this study by Chow and Liu, the changing landscape of home language use in Singapore has an undeniably class-based character. That is, Singaporean homes shifting to English are generally more economically advanced. And such shifts make possible a hierarchy of English varieties where those families that speak the standard variety usually come from more well-to-do backgrounds as well. So in short, Singaporean bilingual education promotes a less than ideal meritocratic reality. Now, as alluded to earlier, studies on language shift through the lens of class are rare. As such, I'm able to provide only a cursory glance at the Malay community with respect to the topic of today. Had there been one that focuses on the Malays, just like the study by Chow and Liu, the findings would not have been different from that found by Chow and Liu. In fact, I would venture to say that the impact would be more severe than the Chinese or Indian communities because Malay students have historically underachieved in Singapore. Moreover, there is a disproportionately large percentage of Malay students, boys in particular, as opposed to girls, in the normal technical stream, which, as discussed earlier, comprise students who are assumed to be academically unfit. And normal technical students largely come from homes that do not speak English as a first language, and one or more of the parents would have lower than average educational qualification. So having parents who are not fluent in English, was a characteristic of underachieving students, as discovered as research studied by Albright in 2006. Furthermore, much work on social class has highlighted the plight of the Malay community. For instance, lie contends that present-day intensification of economic competition is emerging and threatens to assume a class-race overlap, where the economically dominant class is the Chinese population, and the economically weaker ones are the Malays and Indians. And then in his remark on social inequalities in Singapore, Gopinathan and his colleagues single out the Malay community as the weakest, economically and educationally, and suggests that if inequalities are not adequately addressed, it would undermine inter-ethnic social relations because they overlap with ethnic identity. So taken together, as a community at the lowest rung of society, the class-based impact of language shift as experienced by the lower income Chinese families would have been keenly felt by the Malay community too. Right, so I think I'll just conclude at this point by saying that, Singapore puts in place a unique language and education policy by which English is offered as a first language of the school, and one of the 3 official mother tongue languages as a second language subject in the national curriculum. Practicality or instrumentality has been a long-standing justification for Singapore's integration of English into the school system and for making it the medium of instruction. And the goal is to educate the nation's children as English-knowing bilinguals, students with growing proficiency in English plus the mother tongue. And as I've highlighted earlier, 2 unintended consequences have been discussed and highlighted, namely the big shift in home languages, where English has continued to replace the mother tongue languages as the dominant home language, and the class-based character in the changing landscape of home language use. In particular, the impact is keenly felt among the lower income Singaporeans, including the indigenous Malay community. And in the process, I question whether or not Singaporean bilingualism and bilingual education are sociolinguistically and educationally sound in the first place. So thank you. Over to you, Angel.
Thank you so much. To me, it is always interesting to look at the Singapore situation, because where the official definitions of mother tongue is not really the mother tongue. So it is an officially defined mother tongue. Say, for example, in the child's home language, the mother might speak Hainanese or Hokkien or Cantonese. But for this Chinese child, his or her designated mother tongue is Mandarin Chinese. And the same situation might exist for the Malay child, right? The most familiar home variety of language might not be the officially designated mother tongue. So now we really need to recognize the fact that these terms take on different meanings in different contexts, like mother tongue. And also, what does that mean? So you're raising some interesting observations, and I would like to invite our postdoc research fellow, Dr. Song, Dr. Bongji Song, to ask your questions. Over to you, Dr. Song.
Thank you very much. When I it was very interesting to read your articles that talks about the development of Malay, along with the emergence of print and media, which reminds me of Benedict Anderson's Imagine Communities. And I also enjoy reading the Adam and Nalia's Stories in 2021 article, which very nicely captures agency of the two young adults and their educational trajectories in Singapore. You mentioned about the class-based character, and I am still not really sure whether it's really a class-based character or it's also hints on the racial inequalities. So my question is, would class-based character actually be disguise of racial inequalities as mother tongue policy is promoted with ethno-linguistic classifications such as Malay or Chinese and Tamil? In other words, can mother tongue policy be viewed as a basis of racial inequalities where linguistically minoritized people such as Malay attempt to learn English in order to move away from their racial marginalization in Singapore? So for example, with Singapore's state-sponsored meritocratic policy, which puts greater importance on academic achievement that is taught through English, be the key facilitator for the mother tongue policy failure, which raise and promote the global elite who are capable of speaking English. If the students are only capable of speaking or more proficient in their mother tongue, they are being categorized as the minority speakers, while if they are proficient in English, they can be seen as a global elite who has more mobility for social mobilities. So can it be a disguise of this class-based character can be disguise of racial inequalities?
Yeah, how do I respond to this? Thank you for the question. As I've indicated, I've shared earlier on, the Malay community takes a longer time to shift towards English because they are more comfortable with their Malay language, with their the heritage language, the mother tongue. But in the 70s, just about a decade after Singapore separated from Malaysia, the then Minister of Singapore, Mr. Lee Kuan Yew, sent a strong message to the Malay community that you have to, learn the Malay, learn English. You have got to get your children to learn English. If you can't use English, then get your neighbors, get your friends to help you to, to learn English, because by that time, the English medium education has already started to set in. And so we have, a lot of Malay medium schools at that time, not getting the enrollment that ensures their sustainability. So over time, the enrollment in the Malay medium school has gone down until the point where, they have to close down because parents are sending their children to English medium school. But they are of course not proficient in English. And so when children go to an English medium school, of course they would find it difficult to follow because English is not their strong language. And so compared to perhaps the other ethnic groups where English has been a strong motivator for them to use a language, and so now I would just want to respond to your question. You're asking about the inequalities, right? Whether the social class is actually disguised as inequalities. To some extent, yes, I would say that, because there is a book by Lily Zubaida Rahim, which happens to be the niece of the first president of Singapore, and she has been critical about Singapore's education policy, and she is the first to actually write about the marginalization of the Malays in Singapore from the colonial times until post-independence Singapore. And having emerged from colonialism as the least economically strong community, and then compounded by the need to adjust to an English medium education, this further alienates the Malay community from the mainstream of society. So, in a sense, yes, the inequality seems to be extended, being multiplied with the English medium education in school. And I've shared in the slide previously that in the normal technical stream, which is the lowest stream meant for students who are assumed to be academically incapable, majority of the students are Malay students, and that means they are overly represented in that particular stream. So yes, inequality seems to be, what is the word? I lost that word. Seems to be aggravated or seems to be continued, with the English education. I don't know whether I've answered your question, but yeah.
Let's move on to Phoebe, and then Bungi can come back with the second round of questions. Phoebe, what's your question?
Yeah, thank you. And I would like to invite a guest to explain further for our audience about cultural capital, because you publish a lot about how childhood identity and cultural capitals may be interconnected with the mother tongue perspective or the language policy in Singapore. Because for Hong Kong, as a local teacher, I don't know much about Singapore until I watch some educational movies, and they are really meaningful. They try to depict how families, conflicts, or their perception across generation may shape their perspective towards what they own as cultural capitals. Would you mind sharing your thoughts further with the audience so that we can learn more from you and your publications? Thank you.
I think first and foremost, I would like to say that the impact of the language and education policy need not necessarily be ethnic-based. If at all, it is economic-based, because not only are the Malays impacted by the policy, but also lower-income Chinese communities and also the Indian community. So it just so happens that Malay community in general is at the lower rung of the socio-economic ladder. So in that sense, the impact is seen greatest on the Singapore Malay community compared to the other ethnic groups. Now, by cultural capital, for instance, in the study that I've done with Malay children, in fact, my colleague was also working with me on the Chinese children there to look at their literacy practices at home. And one of the things that my colleague, who is a Chinese, when she was helping me to look at the Chinese children's literacy practices at home, she came back to me and said, "I pity the Chinese children in Singapore, because they are driven by their parents to succeed in school, so much so that they have less of their childhood in them." In other words, just to show that the Chinese community, Chinese families, they have a certain motivation to want to see their children succeed, even among the lower socio-economic class. Whereas compared to the Malay families, culturally, they don't see the world as an end in their existence, because they have the afterworld to look back to. And so, the success need not necessarily be measured by academic success. And furthermore, if one were to look at the literacy practices in the home, it is interesting that for parents who do not know English or do not speak English well, well, most of the families that I studied, 8 of them, all of them are concerned about their students' academic achievement in school. Yeah, but they are just not capable of helping their children because of the inadequacy of their English. So what you see in the home is, you can find a parent, a mother, trying to help the child read an English text, but a lot of trans-languaging takes place. The child, knowing that the English is the language of the text, would want to speak English, as she discussed the text of the mother. But the mother is not able to, to speak English well. So, the mother is using, trying to use English, but then in a broken English. And the child, knowing that the mother is not proficient in English, would prefer the mother to use Malay. So there is this, moving back and forth between Malay and English. And the child finally is able to understand the text. Now, so this is one particular literacy practices that are not available in the school. The same child in the classroom, in an English classroom, would not have the, the resources or the help needed to comprehend a text, because the Malay language would be out of bounds within the English language lesson. So that kind of, differences that one can see, the homeschool discontinuity in the literacy practices of the families in Singapore. Yeah.
I see that Dr. April Liu from Education University of Hong Kong, you have a question related to identity and mother tongue.
Yes, so thank you very much, Angel, and thank you very much, Dr. Baca, for this, very precious opportunity for me to know more about the linguistic landscape in Singapore. Actually, I'm just wondering, because just now you mentioned that the mother tongue is sometimes learned as a school subject. And I would like to know, sorry, my kid is calling mommy now. and I would like to know what are the implications on the pupils' and students' identity. Because we know that sometimes Singapore, well, I just know it from my Singaporean friends, that internationalization is a very important goal for education in Singapore. So when the students learn their so-called mother tongue or father's language as a school subject, really far away from their heart, so would they consider themselves as, Singaporean Chinese, Singaporeans, or the, I just imagine it, Americans, Britons, etc. So what are the implications on their identity?
Well, I don't think Singaporeans would consider ourselves as American or British. We are Singaporeans. Despite the shift towards English, despite the younger generation, being more comfortable in English, there has been studies that show that their affiliation to the mother tongue language remains intact. Studies involving secondary students, studies involving university students, generally they seem to show that their affiliation to the mother tongue language is strong, right? But their facility with the language is not as strong. That means they might think that they might, they don't have to think that they are Malay Singaporeans, right? But they don't see themselves as being able to use a language in everyday conversation with friends, with siblings, with even mothers, with parents, except maybe with the grandparents who still use the mother tongue language. So in terms of identity, they still see themselves as either Malay Singaporean, Chinese Singaporeans, but their facility with the language has subsided from generation to generation. Yeah.
Xinhua, you have a question?
Yes, I want to jump in here. I've been listening to Dr. Baka's presentation, and also it's eye-opening for me to know the Singaporean context, even though I have been there for many times. So I was amazed that there are so many languages there, but I never had a chance to think it in this term. And I was also wondering, just now you mentioned about language use. So I was wondering about a methodological problem of the studies that you quoted regarding there are less heritage language used at home. So I would like to say that now it's 6 o'clock in here, and it's the first time in the day that I have opened my mouth. I have been always in my room. Yeah, it's the first time in this day that I've opened my mouth. So if I receive a survey and say, what language do you speak at home? Or how often do you speak your language? Then that will be a very difficult question for me to answer. And I also try to survey what I've been doing every day, even though I haven't been speaking English, haven't been speaking Chinese for the whole day. But I've used both languages like a lot since this morning. I've been like editing my paper. And while I was cooking, I was watching a Chinese show in Chinese. So I was wondering that could this be a methodological problem that leads to this conclusion? Could the Malay students be using the Malay language in other contexts? Could they be watching a movie in Malay that considered as using a language as well? Could they be talking with each other on social media in Malay language, in typing, rather than just like the language is used at home? Do you think that this is like this could be the case?
Yes, it's a good question, Chinghua. The data that I presented taken from the census of population and also the survey conducted by the Ministry of Education. I would think that it requires a lot of thinking on the part of the respondents in order to answer the question whether you use Malay or English in a certain context. Particularly if the question is really general, which language do you use, right? So there is, I agree, there is the possible difficulty there, the possible flaws there in terms of the data that comes out from such studies. In my own study, which we've just started with my colleagues, we did discuss this at length. To what detail do we want to ask the respondents for the same reason that you mentioned? Because what am I going to answer when I speak to my siblings, or when I use to speak to my friends, or when I buy food at a coffee shop? So the data that I present to you is really a general set of questions, but there are other studies that try to fine tune the detail in order to get a more subtle differences in the use of the languages. But I would say that there is even by doing that, I think the outcome will not be too far from the data that has been shared by the ministry and also the census of population. But having said that, there is always that possibility that the respondents might not be saying exactly what is being practiced, and I've seen this for myself, because when I did my ethnographic study, spending hours in the homes of the families which I study, in the semi-structured interviews, they say that they are bilingual, they use English and Malay. But spending hours and hours in their homes, I noticed that many of them actually use English. Most of the time, they use English rather than the mother tongue. So yes, I agree with you that there are potential problems with that. But as far as I'm concerned, we have to start with some data, as general as it may be. But then we have to move on move into studies that could look at the data in greater detail. And I think ethnographic study is one way of looking at the actual day-to-day, moment-by-moment use of the language in the homes.
Thank you.
I'd like to jump in with a question about religious identity, and I'd like to pick your brain on how much relationship is there between the Malay community's religious identity and their ability to maintain or interact in the Malay language, or is it more or less independent because they can be speaking Singaporean English and still be practicing their religious faith? And so I just would like to know the relationship between the Malay languages and the Malay community's religious identification.
Yeah. Thank you. Yes, Islam, the religion of the Malay community, used to be said to be the bastion of the Malay language. By that I mean, even though Islam, the holy book is in Arabic, many of the stories of the Prophet being passed down through Arabic, but then there has been translations, from Arabic to Malay, and historically, Islam has been, propagated to the Malays in this region through the Malay language, because at one point in time, before the colonials came in this part of the world, Malay was a lingua franca. In fact, Malay was a language of Islamic missionary. In fact, the language of the Buddhist missionary and also the Christian missionary. So at one point, Malay is the language of not just Islam, but all religions that came to this part of the world. Relating it to my own generation, I was more comfortable learning about my religion through the medium of Malay, because the religious schools basically use Malay as a medium of instruction. So when I read the translations of the Quran, it gives me more satisfaction reading the translation in Malay rather than English. But my daughter's generation, because they have been exposed to English in school, they would find it more comfortable reading the translations in English rather than in Malay. So, religion now, Islam in particular, is no longer considered, as the stronghold of the Malay language because of the shift in the language. So the shift towards English has also affected the religious sphere as well. And given Singapore's international, standing, you have a lot more, how would I say, a lot more professionals coming to Singapore, foreign workers, professionals, and they are Muslims from India, from Pakistan, from where else in the world, And even within the Malay, within the Singapore society, the Indian communities, although generally they are Hindus, but a significant minority of them are also Muslims, right? And so the Muslim Religious Council in Singapore, in order not to marginalize the non-Malay Muslims in Singapore, they have now, since about 5-10 years ago, recommend that the Friday sermon, the weekly Friday sermon, at least once a month be conducted in English. Now, this is not only to serve the non-Malay Muslim community, but also to serve the younger generation who are more comfortable learning about their religion through the medium of English. And so, the religion can still be practiced, but the language might have shifted from Malay to English. I don't know if I answer your question.
Yeah. So my follow-up question is, so is secularization of the Malay communities, that the Malay communities used to be, it's just my assumption, used to be more religiously oriented. Would you say that the Englishization, Englishization of the Malay communities, like the next generation of the Malay communities being anglicized, speaking more English, is it correlated with the secularization of the Malay communities, or is this not the case? It's just my wild guess.
If at all, people are becoming more religious. Because it's not just about the secularization, the shift towards English, but also what happens outside of Singapore, within the Muslim world. Then the rejuvenation of our Islamic ideals. In fact, I would say that the religiosity of the Malay Muslim community in Singapore isn't shaken by the Anglicization or even the secularization. In fact, it's enhanced by the fact that now the young Muslims can have access not only to religious talks in Malay, but also religious talks in English and beyond the Singapore shores. So you have a lot of talks now in the internet, in the social media, where they can have access to Islam, from outside of Singapore. So much so that the religious scholars in Singapore who are still using the Malay language may not be as well received compared to if they were able to deliver their talks, their sermon in English. So to answer your question, yes, it's not English. The Englishization does not affect the religiosity of the people. But what is interesting is that because traditionally religion has been passed on, being taught through the Malay language. There has been a change even in the religious weekend classes conducted by the Muslim Religious Council. They have shifted to English. But the traditional madrasa, which is in Arabic for school, there are still some centers that conduct Islam through the medium of Malay. And one study that I've done to look at the differences in the way parents react to the religious classes in English and religious classes in Malay. What is interesting is that I think that the Malay community is caught in between the ideals of Englishization, the need to be proficient in English, the need to learn and use English for the purpose of education and economy. At the same time, they are also concerned about the loss of the Malay language by the fact that they are not using the language, right? So some parents still send their children to a religious school which still uses Malay, even though they know that the children learn better through English. The only reason being because they want their children to have that extra exposure to the Malay language, which they get very limited exposure in school. Yeah? So so they have this they have to vacillate between, going along with the policy of English being the premium language at the same time trying to ensure that the children are still able to understand and use. As the religiosity is concerned, there's very little impact.
Thank you so much. I'd like to invite Bongi to continue with your question. Yeah.
Thank you again. And then one of my question is related to language policy in Singapore.
I can't really hear you, Bongi. I can't.
Okay.
No, I think my connection is bad. I can't hear you.
Okay.
I can't make sense of what you're saying.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Okay, now it's okay. Yeah.
Okay, good. So I'm kind of getting more sympathetic with Singapore's situation where language shifts occur from mother tongue to English, as with pressure for Singapore to compete in globalization, where has very little natural resources, and a lot of the economy is dependent on the finance and education. So, and I'm wondering, is there any alternative educational language and education policy that can promote both mother tongue and English? Do you think a translanguaging perspective in policy can be an alternative possibility?
I'm glad you asked that question. Because I think there is an alternative to what is being practiced in Singapore. In my, I think when I was in that slide, or I was explaining the possible, reason behind the separation of languages in Singapore schools, where English is separated from the mother. Both languages cannot be mixed, and that also involves the way cognitively we process the language. But that has, research has shown that there is that kind of thinking is rather outdated. But that is, I think, the perspective underlying the Singapore's language in education policy. As I've said, because they want to ensure that English is the language that students would acquire and be proficient in, to the mother tongue language not only being taught as a second language. In fact, some of the recommendations after the review of the mother tongue, language curriculum, is to make it even more simple to the children. They call it syllabus B, right? So it's not just a second language, but even lower than a second language. Because again, the idea that English takes precedence over the other languages, right? But I think this is one sacred cow that they cannot get over with, that they can't think, they can't, come up with any other alternative, because that is the way the thinking is behind the, English and mother tongue, English as a first language, mother tongue as a second language. But I've been around the world looking at other bilingual programs being administered in certain schools, and there are programs where both languages are being used as a medium of instruction. Because I can't remember the scholar now who says that in a society where there is one dominant language, if the minority language is not used together with the dominant language as a medium of instruction, there is more likelihood that that minority language would not survive, right? And so in some schools that I've visited in Auckland, New Zealand, in Hawaii, in Wales, both languages are being used as mediums of instruction. So that means exposure to the language is important, right? In Singapore, 6 hours out of 40 hours is very minimal. It's not even, I don't know, it's not even 30% of the curriculum time. So exposure to the language is, I think, important. And studies have shown in such a situation, the English is not being overwhelmed, or rather, the proficiency English is not affected, right? And so they did a comparison between one system which is almost like Singapore, where English is the main language, and then the foreign language is being taught as a second language, compared to another system where both languages are used as medium of instruction. And this can occur in many different ways, right? And the tests have shown that for both groups of students, the English proficiency is almost the same. Whether you learn English as a first language, as the main language, or whether English is learned together with another language, the proficiency level of English is the same. But the proficiency of the mother tongue is so much higher in the program where both languages are being used as medium of instruction, compared to to the mother tongue being used only, the second language being used only as a second language. So there are evidence to show that there are other alternatives that can be done, that can be practiced, and this works in a society where there is a dominant language, because studies have also shown that where there is a dominant language, it is harder to maintain that minority language, as evidence in the Singapore society. No matter how. I was always telling my students that we have to consider ourselves lucky, because in our system, at least the mother tongue is made as a compulsory subject, even as a second language, compared to systems abroad where there's no way that your mother tongue is being you can learn your mother tongue in school, right? So to some extent, we are fortunate that second language is the mother tongue is being taught as a second language, but it has shown that it is not enough. Mother tongue learned as a second language would not enable us to produce students who are capable in English and the mother tongue language. So there is a need to review this and to orientate the way we think about how humans process language. Instead of having two separate compartments, there is actually just one processor that processes all languages, right?
Mm-hmm.
In response to your question whether translanguaging is appropriate, I would say that yes, it does help to make meaning, to enable students to make meaning out of the everyday context in which they find themselves in the classroom. But translanguaging would also mean giving less time for the mother tongue language as it is, right? But if in a program where both languages are given the equal amount of time, both languages are being used as mediums of instruction, then I think that is a situation where translanguaging would actually flourish, would actually develop students much more as a bilingual, as a multilingual, compared to what it is now. I don't know. Angel might have something to say about this. Yeah.
Thank you. I think I want to jump in here. Translanguaging in the classroom and translanguaging in the popular cultural everyday lives of the young people. So I just want to again ask you, even though you and I are not young people, but I like to ask whether in your observations, young Malays, do they often translanguage between Malay and Singlish and vice versa, right? Because, and also
Yes,
Malay pop culture, you do, right? And
Yeah,
Malay
you
pop
do,
culture,
yeah.
like
Yeah.
do young Singaporeans, Malay Singaporeans, do they listen to hip hop or popular songs which rap in the translanguaging way, like in
Yeah, they do.
yeah?
Yeah,
So then,
translanguaging happens, at, even in a solely English class, even in a solely Malay class, translanguaging happens, right? But at a policy level, translanguaging is not seen as something which is being encouraged.
yeah, so that's where I like to put in our leverage, because if young Malay people they translanguage naturally in their pop culture, in their everyday lives, then there are strong arguments to leverage on their everyday practices in the classroom, so as to help them to understand, to raise their meta-linguistic awareness or meta-language awareness. That could help them become bilinguals. I mean, English and Malay bilinguals.
Yeah, translanguaging happens much more in the mother tongue language classes than in English classes or mathematics or sciences, which occur in English. As far as the teachers are concerned, the mother tongue language teachers are more open to translanguaging because they know that their students are very much English dominant. They can't express in a full sentence in a mother tongue language sometimes, and so the students are often using all their linguistic resources to make meaning, as you said, in order to understand what is going on in the classroom. But in the content subjects, such as English, mathematics, I suppose translanguaging happens too, right? But the complexity in that situation is that there are, it's not just one ethnic group of students in one class.
That's right.
And so the teacher could be a Chinese teacher, could be a Malay teacher, and so they can help translanguage, based on the language that they're proficient in, but not in the other language.
My own understanding is they translanguage between Singlish and academic English.
Even teachers speak more Singlish these days rather than standard English.
Singlish is, in its own right, a home language, I think.
Yes, it is.
A mother tongue,
it is a home language.
Right? Yeah. So I was.
If I talk to you, and then if I'm not conscious of the language I use, I might just, move to Singlish because
I know I would do the same. I would do the same too. I mean, with Cantonese, Hong Kong style English. I like to ask this cultural identification and Malaysia, because Singapore is so close to Malaysia, and also close to Indonesia. So, observing young students, young teachers, do you think they are culturally identifying with Malaysia, okay? Malaysia, okay? Or Indonesia? Because Singapore politically wants to be separate in terms of its identity. I'm Singaporean, even though I'm ethnic Malay, right? I don't want to be identified as Malaysian or Indonesian. So this distinctive Singaporean identity, and it's very interesting. How does it interact with your work in trying to maintain and revive the Malaysian language among younger people?
Right. Well, historically, if you know the history of this region called the Malay archipelago, Malay used to be the lingua franca in this region, even though, in different islands in this archipelago, they have their own, indigenous language. But Malay is often the second language that they picked up. Of course, there are areas where Malay itself is the indigenous language. For instance, like in Singapore, in Malaysia, parts of Indonesia, even South Thailand, parts of the southern Philippines, they are indigenous Malays. They speak, the Malay language. But then with colonization, this area has been carved out by the British, by the Dutch, and by the Spanish, right? So parts of the Philippines, by the Spanish, they gained independence from Spain, and when Spain or Spanish colonials were here, they took part of that Malay-speaking area. The British and the Dutch also did sign a treaty where the Dutch says, okay, I'll take Sumatra, and 1/3 of Borneo, whereas the British take 1/3 of Borneo and the Malay Peninsula. Between what is now Indonesia and Malaysia and Singapore, we have been separated politically quite early on in the 40s, right? But between Singapore and Malaysia, we were only separated recently, well, not really recently, but more than 50 years ago in 1965, right? Whereas Indonesia has been independent since 48 under the colonial rule. So with these political boundaries, there is less, intermixing, less movement because it's becoming more difficult. Yeah, as compared to previously, because the Malays and this region, they are seafaring people, they're maritime people. They move from one island to another. But then when the colonials came, and then they set out artificial boundaries, and so there is less movement between people. And so over time, the Malay spoken in the Dutch territory has acquired its own distinctive character, so much so that they had renamed the Malay language there as Bahasa Indonesia. So Bahasa Indonesia is actually a variety of Malay. In Malaysia and Singapore, we are closer. At one point, Malaysia, when they gained independence, they renamed the Malay language as Bahasa Malaysia, right? Well, Singapore retains the word Bahasa Malay. So historically, we are closer to Malaysia compared to Indonesia because of the political separation that happens much earlier on. But again, with Singapore being independent from Malaysia, we have acquired our own distinctive, identity as well. Language-wise, if I were to go to Malaysia, and if I were to queue to buy a ticket to get to the tower, whatever, the moment I open my mouth, they will know that I'm from Singapore. It happened to me. I just asked in Malay, innocently asking in Malay if I can get this ticket, and the cash was like, "Yeah, from Singapore." Yeah, yeah. So I this historical body in me is, just cannot, is always with me, right?
You're mutually intelligible. Mutually intelligible.
It's mutually intelligible. Yeah, between Malay in Singapore and Malay in Malaysia, and it's almost similar, except that in terms of intonation, accent, a slight difference. But generally, there's no problem. The difficulty is with Bahasa Indonesia, because they have acquired, for instance, words that have been translated from English. They are translated using Dutch morphology, whereas in Singapore and Malaysia, we use the English morphology. For instance, the word faculty, right? In Indonesia, the Malay version of faculty is fakultas, because as is the suffix used in Dutch. Whereas in Malay and Singapore and Malaysia, we use faculty. And then there's also a lot of vocabulary differences, because Indonesia has also a lot of other indigenous languages that contribute towards the Bahasa Indonesia there. And Singapore and Malaysia too have our own, local languages to enrich language. So in terms of language, yes, we are closer to Malaysia. But in terms of identity as Singaporean, I think they are rather different in the sense that we have experienced a life where Malay is not privileged, as compared to in Malaysia, where Malay is privileged, right? And so, and we don't have to deny it in Malay because politically Malay is in power, the Malay side in power. So they have, they are in a privileged position to decide on. But we have experienced life in Singapore in a so-called meritocratic, and we struggle, and our experience is different from
Right.
Malaysia.
Right.
And so identity-wise, we
You're
could
not
be
a
seen as
dominant
rather
group.
different. Yeah, we are not a dominant group. Yeah.
As in fact, I would say that the Singaporean government would be very cautious about the emergence of a very strong Malay identity or Malay identification with Malaysia, which is a much stronger, bigger country next door. So here is Saskia's question. Hi, Saskia. Saskia, I read. Thank you for this deep look into the sociolinguistic context of Singapore. And here's her question. I'm curious about how policymakers have responded to the unintended shifts you described. Well, here I say, I don't think it's unintended, even though I'm just wildly guessing.
I'm just being politically correct.
I think it's kind of well, maybe intended, okay? But I'll let you answer the question.
Yes. Yeah, as I said, it's the politically correct thing to say that it is unintended. How Singapore survives. It survives on its human resources. It doesn't have any natural resources to back its economy. So the only way is to actually depend on its people, and by depending on the people, it means getting that few who can come out of the school system successful in terms of how the school defines as successful, right? And this is normally the elite group, right? Who is at home is very proficient in English. They speak the standard English and not the colloquial English, And so there is interest to keep this group of people successful within the existing system. Right. So there is this interest to keep the elite group. I'm not being politically correct here, but that's how I think it is. Despite, because I don't think that they don't understand about the consequences of the present language in education policy. But I think there is a need to keep the status quo in some ways, so that this group of people who are proficient in English, academically strong because they are proficient in English, they're able to receive knowledge in a much more comfortable, easier way because it's a language that is used at home. So there is continuity in what happens in the home and in school as compared to those who are speaking mother tongue or speaking Singlish, and then they have to unlearn and relearn in school, and that might take time, and that could also impede their progress in school. So yes, I think it is. Because the reforms that have been recommended does not really shift anything. To me, it's like fighting fires. You just extinguish the fire that comes out. But you don't really find the source of the fire. And to me, the source of the fire is in the equitable distribution of time to both English and the mother tongue languages.
Okay, let's have a last round of questions, and then I'm aware of the time. So Phoebe, over to you again, and then April, and then Chinghua.
Yeah, thank you. And actually, another aspect that aroused my curiosity to know more about the issues about language shifts in Singapore would be how it would affect children's aspiration towards their success. For example, like academic success, because I have been meeting some researchers in some international conference, and they are from Singapore. To me, their logics are totally scientific, and they are very conscious about being productive academically, are aware of the language that they should use. And then I'm thinking if we try to discuss the issues today with more awareness towards multilingualism, or how they may develop some emotional engagement with their home languages. So would it also affect the way they see how they may attain international identity or success in their future academic prospect or something like that? And would it affect the way that they acquire, for example, like science knowledge or some professional knowledge in the future? That's in my mind when I interact with researchers from Singapore, because to me they are really professional, self-disciplined, and very good. But I sense a kind of keen competitions in the society behind as well. Yeah, that's my observation based on minimum social interaction. So would you mind sharing your thoughts on this?
Yes, I have just alluded, very briefly about the meritocratic principle in Singapore. That has been a sacred cow in Singapore. But of course, you know that meritocracy ensures that everyone is given the same treatment, but it doesn't ensure the same outcome, right? And in Singapore, meritocracy, the term meritocracy has been used oftentimes to cajole people to work hard, to work hard in order to achieve success. And so within this kind of framework, if you don't, then the failure is yours, because you don't work hard, and so others work hard, so they succeed, you don't succeed. So there is always that competition, to achieve success in school, in workplaces. But the outcome may not necessarily be equitable, right? So meritocracy is meant to make everyone equal, give the same treatment to everyone. But in terms of the outcome, it will not be the same, because different people start at a different starting point, because precisely the reason I said earlier about how the literacy practices, the language practices in the home are not conducive, are not the dominant kind of practices that are valued in school. So in terms of cultural capital, the cultural capital at home, the language capital, the social capital might find little value in the school. And so even though they work hard, they might not get the outcome that they want. And I think the government realized this, but the way they address the situation is by by introducing different pathways in school. That means to say that success is not calibrated in terms of good results in the academic, And so from primary school, they have started to have different paths for different students. Some might be strong in sports, some might be strong in music, some might be strong in mathematics. And so schools have been developed to create their own niche. And so students can gravitate towards a school that best match their talents, so to speak. And so different pathways have been made available. And so success is not just measured in one way, but in many different ways. Again, to me, this is not really addressing the problem. It's just to me, it's just a filtering process in a factory. When the materials come in, you filter the big stones are filtered from the small stones, from the tiny stones, but then you don't actually try to solve the core issues that are that people are facing, right? So, like some scholars said, school is just a reproduction process, so it's a filtering process. So those who are academically inclined, based on the system, would of course go into the academic path. Those who are less inclined go to the other path. So there is different niches for different people at this point in time. As regard to your experience with Singaporeans, yes, I think that we have the term in Singapore, kiasu. I do not know whether you use the word in Singapore, in Hong Kong. Kiasu is a Cantonese. I think it's a Chinese word. I don't know whether it's Cantonese or kiasu, meaning you don't want to lose out, right? So kiasu, meaning that people are kiasu because they want to not to lose out. So I suppose what you saw is a depiction of how Singaporeans would try to emulate success, to achieve success by doing the best they can. I hope I answered your question. Yeah, thank you.
So much. Thank you.
So April, thanks. April, you have any questions?
Yes, Dr. Bakar. So, in your observation, is there any negative feeling from the young Malay people in Singapore that actually they don't have much chances to speak in their own language and get to know more about their own language? Thank you very much.
Right. The situation has come to a point where they don't really care if they don't speak the Malay language, because they're so comfortable in English. In fact, they find it an obstacle to learn Malay because they don't see the relevance of Malay in their day-to-day life. As I've said previously, in religion, Malay is being used, but then now, even the religious institutions have changed to accommodate the shift towards English. So majority of the students would consider it a blessing in disguise if they don't need to learn the Malay language in school, because they don't see the relevance of the language, except for my own student teachers. I always tell my student teachers that you have a heavy burden on you, because the tidal waves against you is so much, that you have to do something, to really make
battle.
it's an uphill battle. Yeah. So in short, that's how I would answer your question.
It's interesting. It's kind of like the immigrant children's situation in Canada, like the Korean child, Hong Kong child, or Chinese child. They just hate to learn their heritage language. They just, English is enough, right? Don't force me to learn Korean, Japanese, or Chinese, right? So Singapore has so successfully established itself as an English-speaking country. Singaporean English in its own right, Singlish, it's English-speaking country. So it's very interesting phenomenon, sociolinguistically and sociopolitically. Yeah, I'd like to ask Chinghua, last but not least, your question.
Well, I don't think if that's a question. I think it's more like a response and comments to what also about my experience having Singaporean Chinese friends. That it was quite right that the friend was like just prefer to speak English all the time. Then we just type in English, even though both of us can do Chinese. But he feels like the only time that he uses Chinese is to watch the TV drama from China. That's the only time that he would like yeah, that's like used the main time that he uses Chinese. So I really see that today. I think it's a very fruitful discussion today, that I get a chance to be able to listen to different perspective and uh, know what is going on in Singapore, and to even open the door of thinking about these issues. I think that's quite important too. Yeah, I'm really interested in the topic that yeah, I would like to say, I mean, if there's a research method or way that we can look more into the details, like you have mentioned, that how they use language in everyday life, even if when they are silent at their own room, doing things on the internet. Yeah, I think that will be an interesting study as well. So thank you very much for giving us this opportunity, and thank you very much for your talk.
Yeah, I want to thank, yeah, Dr. Baka. I mean, I've always been fascinated by Singapore. Singapore is a design city. Design, everything is designed or engineered. So we can consider Singapore.
Social engineering is part and parcel of life in Singapore.
And sociolinguistic laboratory is very interesting because lots of sociolinguistic engineering, and people seem to be okay with it. So you see a lot of designer and engineering traces of the designer and the engineer in sociolinguistic and sociocultural domains, and yet people seem to be okay with it. So as educational researchers, I'm extremely interested in this big sociolinguistic laboratory called Singapore. So yeah, let's thank Dr. Muklis Abu Bakar again for today's very illuminating seminar. And
My pleasure.
So next Friday we have another TLTS research seminar with speakers from the York University, Toronto, and is maybe Chinghua can pull out the um, poster. We have critical plurilingualism in an age of Anglophone hegemony. Now you can see that in Singapore we have English as the dominant language, but you do have Singaporean English. So this is a very interesting topic. So please tune in next Friday, North American time, and Saturday morning, Asian Pacific time. So thanks again, and then see you next week. I mean, see all of our audience next week. Bye.
Bye bye.
Thanks again.